Muslims and skeptics love to claim that the Gospels weren't written by eyewitnesses, but by anonymous authors far removed from the events. If that's true, though, it's shocking how often the Gospels nail historical facts, right down to tiny details that are hard to fake. And when you compare them to apocryphal Gospels like the Gospel of Peter or the Gospel of Barnabas, the difference is night and day. In this video, I'm going to look at 4 examples that dismantle this myth, and trust me, it's just the tip of the iceberg. For starters, Luke's Gospel tells a story where some Pharisees warn Jesus that Herod Antipas wants to kill him. Jesus shrugs it off, calling Herod a fox and saying that he's heading to Jerusalem anyway. Seems pretty straightforward, right? But dig into the geography and history, and it's clear this isn't something someone just made up. The story appears in a section of Luke's Gospel that's hard to pin down chronologically. Scholars call it achronological narration. Luke chunks things together without worrying about the exact order. But here's the thing, if Jesus isn't in Galilee anymore, why would Herod Antipas, who rules in Galilee, be a threat? Luke tells us multiple times that Herod Antipas ruled Galilee, but here's what Luke doesn't mention. According to the Jewish historian Josephus, Herod also ruled Perea, a strip of land east of the Jordan River. And guess where Jesus was the months before his death? Yep, Perea. The other Gospels back this up. Matthew 19:1 and Mark 10:1 say that Jesus went beyond the Jordan. And John 10:40 through 41 says that he hung out where John the Baptist used to baptize. Even though Luke doesn't spell this out, the story lines up perfectly. The Pharisees' warning makes total sense if Jesus was in Perea, where Herod's authority still applied. This detail isn't flashy or forced. Luke just mentions it casually. Getting Herod's jurisdiction right without knowing the specifics isn't easy. It's too precise to be luck and too casual to be staged. It feels rooted in real events. Now, compare this to the Gospel of Barnabas, a late medieval knockoff trying way too hard to sound legit. It claims Herod Antipas ruled Jerusalem and Judea, but the real Herod Antipas governed Galilee, not Judea. This is what fake history looks like, throwing names around without a clue about the actual history. Here's another one from Luke. He's the only Gospel who gives us the story of Jesus raising a widow's son in Nain. Nain is a tiny Galilean town about 10 miles south of Nazareth. Jesus and his crew walk towards the city gate and encounter a funeral procession. The dead man's mom, a widow, is absolutely devastated. Jesus tells her, "Don't cry," then raises her son. Neat story and all, but here's where it gets interesting. The Babylonian Talmud mentions differing funeral customs in Galilee and in Judea. In Judea, mourners walk behind the bier, but in Galilee, they walk in front of it. Knowing that, the story makes perfect sense. Jesus meets the mother first because she's leading the procession out of the gate, then goes to the bier. Who would include such a random cultural detail unless they actually knew it? This screams eyewitness testimony. Now, compare this again to the Gospel of Barnabas, which hilariously places Nain on the shore of the Sea of Galilee, a huge geographical blunder. Let's take a look at a couple of cool examples in John's Gospel. In John 19, the soldiers divide up Jesus' clothes at the crucifixion. As it turns out, Roman law, as noted in Justinian's Digest, lets executioners keep the belongings of the condemned. But there's more here. John implies that there were 4 soldiers without explicitly stating it. He mentions they divided the clothes into 4 shares, one for each soldier. This lines up with Roman military practices, where a standard guard, called a quaternion, was made up of 4 men, and we know this from reading Polybius. John's accuracy is effortless and consistent, the kind of detail you get from somebody who was there, not someone making things up centuries later. Now, contrast this with the so-called Gospel of Peter, which claims Jewish priests were at Jesus' tomb waiting. Levitical law forbids priests from being near the dead. That's the kind of sloppy mistake you would expect from a late forgery. Let's take a look at one more example. At the end of the Feast of Tabernacles, Jesus makes a bold move. He stands up on the last day, the climax of the festival, and shouts, "If anyone is thirsty, let him come to me and drink. He who believes in me, as the scripture has said, out of his heart shall flow rivers of living water." Now, why does the timing matter? Back then, the Feast of Tabernacles featured a daily water pouring ceremony from the Pool of Siloam, symbolizing God's provision and spirit. The Talmud even says, one who did not see the celebration of the place of the drawing of water never saw a celebration in his days. By the time John's Gospel is written, likely after the temple's destruction in 70 AD, those rituals were history. Jesus' dramatic call to those who are thirsty to come to him and drink and receive a spiritual river of living water makes sense only in the light of the customs of his time. This again looks like testimony of somebody who was actually there, not writing long after the events, just making things up. Now, compare this again to the Gospel of Barnabas. Chapter 15 says the Feast of Tabernacles was near in Jesus' first year of ministry, but chapter 30 brings up the Cenophagea, the exact same festival as happening that year too. The words actually mean the same thing. It's a sloppy repeat that shows zero understanding of Jewish customs. The Gospels nail the details, culture, geography, you name it, screaming eyewitnesses were here. Forgeries like Barnabas or Peter, they flop hard. Stacking up the real Gospels against the fakes should strengthen your faith.